Why are we the only species on Earth that looked at a bundle of leaves, decided to set them on fire, and then inhaled the smoke? If you walk into any city today, you see it everywhere. Outside office buildings, in quiet alleys, at social gatherings. It's an act so ingrained in our daily lives that we rarely stop to ask why it exists in the first place. But if you think our ancestors started doing this just for fun, to catch a buzz or kill time, you've completely misunderstood the ancient mind. The story of smoking isn't just about a habit, it is an 11,000-year-old experiment in chemistry, survival, and the human need to regulate our own consciousness. And the truth about when it started is much stranger than you think. Let's go back to the beginning. We're talking about a time when survival was the only currency that mattered. When we look at the archaeological record, especially in the Near East, we don't find evidence of recreational smoking. Instead, we find something far more practical. Imagine living in a semi-permanent settlement 10,000 years ago. Your biggest enemies aren't just predators, they are invisible, parasites, biting insects, and the constant threat of infection. This is the first layer of the smoke story. Burning specific plants wasn't a choice, it was a biological defense mechanism. When you burn certain types of brush or aromatic herbs, the chemical compounds released into the air act as a natural repellent. By sitting near that smoke, you were effectively creating a perimeter. You were using the environment to engineer a safer space for yourself and your family. In this context, smoking was a tool, just as vital as a stone knife or a sharpened spear. But here is where the story shifts, from survival to science. As humans spent more time observing which plants reacted differently when burned, they began to notice something else. Certain plants didn't just drive away bugs, they numbed pain. They quieted a throbbing toothache, or dulled the edge of a hunger pang. This is the moment I call the accidental scientist phase. Our ancestors weren't just bumbling through the woods, they were cataloging their world with incredible precision. They learned that if you dried a certain leaf to just the right level of humidity and burned it in a restricted chamber, a pipe, the potency of the medicine increased. We see this in the artifacts. Pipes recovered from these early sites aren't just crude sticks. They show wear patterns and internal residue that reveal a sophisticated understanding of heat and airflow. They were controlling the delivery of medicine. They were, for all intents and purposes, the first pharmacologists. Now I want you to consider the so what of this. Why does this matter to you, sitting here in 2026? It matters because the psychology hasn't changed. Today you might use a vape, a cigarette, or even a herbal tea to handle stress or anxiety. You're doing exactly what your ancestors did, just with a different delivery system. We have always had an innate drive to regulate our internal state. When the world feels too loud, too chaotic, or too painful, we look for ways to adjust the frequency. We look for a lever to pull that brings us back to homeostasis. 11,000 years ago, that lever was a stone pipe filled with wild, potent botanicals. Today, the tools have evolved, but the underlying need to control our own neurochemistry remains the defining trait of our species. But there is a deeper, darker, and more social side to this. Eventually, the pipe left the survival camp and moved into the ritual circle. We see this in the archaeological evidence, where pipes and smoke-related tools appear in burial pits, or next to central hearths in communal buildings. This is when smoking transformed, from a private tool for survival into a shared language. Think about the social dynamics of a fire. You're sitting with your tribe, the smoke is rising, and everyone is inhaling the same substance. You're all entering the same physiological state simultaneously. That is a powerful bonding mechanism. It creates a shared reality, a moment of synchronized consciousness that strengthens the group identity. It's no coincidence that this is also when the pipes start to get decorative. We see carvings. We see ornate stonework. The object itself became a status symbol, a physical manifestation of the tribe's mastery over their botanical environment. The transition from a survival tool to a social ritual is the real turning point in human evolution. It marks the moment we realized that we could manipulate our environment to change how we felt, and then share that experience with others to build stronger, more cohesive tribes. This is where we need to address the elephant in the room, the addictive nature of these habits. We often judge ourselves for our modern dependencies, but looking at the history, it's clear that we have been hacking our own biology since we first walked out of the caves. We are a species that has never been satisfied with our baseline state. We have always reached for something else, something to calm the nerves, something to elevate the spirit, something to make the burden of existence just a little bit lighter. This brings us to the most counterintuitive fact of all. Most of us imagine that the further back we go in history, the dumber or more primitive people were. We look at a stone pipe and think, how cute, they didn't know better. But the archaeology tells a completely different story. To successfully identify which plants are medicinal, how to process them, how to dry them without them rotting, and how to build a chamber that concentrates the smoke for human inhalation, requires an incredibly high level of intelligence. It requires patience, observational skill, and a deep intuitive understanding of botany. These weren't primitive people stumbling into a habit. They were masterful observers who recognized the hidden potential in the landscape. They weren't slaves to their environment. They were actively reshaping it. So, what is the takeaway when we look at this history from the vantage point of 2026? We are living in a time where we are constantly bombarded with new ways to modulate our feelings, from technology to supplements. It feels like we are living in a unique era of high stress and high intervention. But when you look at that ancient pipe, you realize we are just the latest chapter in a very long, very human book. We are part of a continuous line of beings who have always looked at the natural world and asked, how can I use this to survive? And how can I use this to feel differently? The surprising archaeological evidence isn't that ancient humans smoked. It's that they were so much like us. They struggled with the same existential pressures. They looked for the same relief. And they used the same creative intelligence to find it. When you think about your own habits, your own stresses, and your own desire to find a moment of peace in a hectic day, remember that you aren't fighting a modern battle. You are engaging in a behavior that has been part of the human experience since we first stood upright. You are carrying on a tradition that started in the dirt of a Neolithic settlement. A tradition of reaching out into the world and pulling in whatever we can to make sense of our place in it. As we close this timeline, I want you to think about what the next step might be. If our ancestors used smoke to protect themselves and then used it to bond, and eventually used it to soothe, what are we doing now? We've moved from stone pipes to digital screens and synthetic chemicals. But the underlying motivation, the search for homeostasis, hasn't changed by a single degree. The history of smoking is really the history of human adaptability. It is the story of a species that refused to be at the mercy of its environment, and decided instead to take a bit of that environment into its own lungs, into its own bloodstream, and into its own mind. It's a messy story. It's a complicated story. But it is, without a doubt, a distinctly human one. When you look at those ancient sites, don't just see the dirt and the stone. See the people. See the tribal elders sitting around the fire, trying to protect their young from the pests that could kill them. See the healers trying to find a way to stop a child from crying in pain. See the community coming together in the ritual smoke to solidify their bonds against an uncertain world. That is the reality behind the history. And maybe, just maybe, understanding that will change how you look at the world around you today. We are all still standing around that same fire, looking for the same relief, and trying to make sense of the exact same life. The only thing that has changed is the perspective we bring to it. Thanks for taking this trip down the timeline with me. What part of this story felt the most personal to you? Let me know in the comments. We are just getting started.